When we read in the Bible, when we read in the New Testament about Jesus Christ, what we see is that he demonstrated nonviolent love towards friends and enemies. We can see that he taught the Jews to love their enemies, the Gentiles, not just fellow Jews, but also Gentiles, especially who were enemies in the Old Testament, of course. These two became one new man, as we learned in the teaching upon peace, where we read that in the writings of Paul. We also see that Jesus showed nonviolent love even whenever violence might have been called for by the Mosaic law. We see, for example, whenever the Pharisees tried to test him by bringing to him a woman who was caught in the act of adultery. According to the Mosaic law, both the man and the woman deserved death. And yet Jesus didn't even apply death to the woman. Had he wanted to keep that law to the letter, he would have went and found the man, and he would have had them both stoned. And he would have said, Pharisee, you see, you have to kill them both if you want to keep God's law. But instead, he doesn't do that, and he allows the woman to go and forgives her of her sin. Go and sin no more. He says, I don't condemn you, right? So we see nonviolence there. We see nonviolence whenever Jesus meets the woman at the well. Here is a Samaritan. And when you read in the Old Testament, these are not friends of Jews, right? And so Jesus doesn't trash talk to the Samaritan woman. He doesn't push her down the well. He doesn't treat her violently. He treats her with nonviolent love. He has mercy upon the centurion who comes and asks for his servant to be healed. Here is the centurion who is oppressing the land of Israel. They were occupying it, right? This was a big problem for the Jews. They didn't like this. And so Jesus showing mercy and kindness and nonviolent love towards even the centurion. We could go through and list others. He shows Gentiles mercy. He shows the woman who comes and begs that some of the crumbs from the table fall to the dogs. And he says, wow, you have great faith. He heals the demon-possessed man who was in Gadara, in Decapolis, which was known to be a very populated Gentile area. So the point is that Jesus demonstrated nonviolent love towards friends and enemies, and this is without doubt. We all know this. In fact, he even teaches it in his Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 38 and 39. It says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Where did we hear this? Well, we heard this in the Old Testament, right? We heard this in the Old Testament law. Okay, so it says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you to not resist an evil person. Whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also, right? Matthew 5:38. In Luke chapter 6, verse 27 and 28, Jesus says, but I say to you who hear, love your enemies and do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who spitefully use you. Okay, this is clearly nonviolent love that Jesus is teaching to show not just to your friends. In fact, he even points out when we read verses 43 through 48, he makes the point, what good is it if you just show this kind of nonviolent love to your friends? He's like, even the pagans know how to do that. He said, I'm talking about showing nonviolent love to even those who are considered your enemies. He says in Matthew 5:44 and 45, but I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. Why would we do this? Well, the answer is right here. That you may be sons of your Father in heaven. Now, why are we loving our enemies? Why would we bother loving our enemies? I mean, when Jesus comes and says, you love your enemies, why would we do this? Well, Jesus is providing not just the instruction to love our enemies, he's giving us the reason why we love our enemies. We love them so that we can be like God. We can be like the Father. For your Father is kind to the just and the unjust. He causes it to rain on the just and the unjust. So this is the Father's will. He says, I'm not doing my will. He says, I'm doing my Father's will. I don't speak my words. I'm speaking my Father's words. He's telling us to love our enemies. Why? Because the Father loves his enemies. We're being like our Father. In fact, he says in verse 48, therefore you shall be perfect just as your Father in heaven is perfect. Jesus lays down his life, so they kill him, they crucify him. He is unjustly arrested. He is taken and has a mock trial and then put before the people, and democracy reigns, and they choose the violent murderer, insurrectionist Barabbas. because they think violence is the way to solve it. They're going to find out 40 years later they should have listened to Jesus. Had the Jews listened to Jesus whenever he said, love your enemies, they wouldn't be rabble-rousing in 70 A.D., bringing the wrath of Rome down on their heads, right? Had they listened to Jesus, he said, love your enemies. That includes Rome. Love them. Pray for them. Why? So you'll be perfect. Like who? Like God. Because God does this. Why do we love our enemies? Because God loves his enemies. Proof? Look at Jesus. Jesus loved his enemies. And Jesus, of course, is the image, the invisible image of God. He says, I and the Father are one. He who has seen me has seen the Father. So Jesus is telling us that if we love our enemies, we look like God. Also, I don't have time to get into Luke 19, but if you go to Luke 19, 42, 43 in your own time, you'll read that it says, as Jesus approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, if only you had known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. If the Jews had obeyed Jesus, as I said, would their city have been ransacked and their temple burned to the ground? Had they not been following the zealots who wanted to bring, Rome had a lot going on. Rome wasn't in the business of just destroying towns and villages because it made, because they wanted to. They wanted to make money from their colonies or from their, the places they occupied. And so Judea was making a big stink, and they were fighting against the Romans, bringing the Romans' ire to them. Had they followed Jesus, we have to think what might have happened.